And this chapter will provide you with an overview of autism spectrum disorder.
This information will help you better understand your options as you work toward providing the most appropriate treatment for your child's needs and circumstances.
We'll also share with you some stories from families who have been right where you are now.
Autism is a neurodevelopmental disorder. That is, it's a disorder based in the brain. It's a disorder that unfolds over the course of development. And it's a disorder that we diagnose based on observation of behaviors. There's no blood tests, there's no brain tests, there's no tests that we can do that quickly say, oh, right, this child is autism. It's really based on looking for different behaviors in two domains. The first domain is a domain of social communication, and the second domain is a domain which we call the repetitive and restricted interests and behaviors domain. And it's a disorder that we diagnose more often in boys than in girls.
And you might ask what causes it, and the answer very quickly comes to an I don't know. We're getting closer to being in a position where we can talk about risks for things that might increase the likelihood of someone developing autism. And one of the major areas of advancement that has taken place in the area of risks has been in genetics. All of us believe that there are also very important environmental factors that must contribute to the risk too. In the same way that the risk for a sunburn is related to how fair our skin might be, the genetic factors that set us up for whether we can be in the sun for 10 or 15 minutes or what have you before we get a burn. The fact is that the sun still has to be there for that sunburn to happen. So there's an environmental component that ultimately needs to be engaged for the sunburn or for autism, if you want to think about it that way. And how we combine these genetic predispositions with the environmental factors is something that we're just starting to unravel. So families who are sitting with the diagnosis now are going to know a lot more in the coming years. And the people that are involved in helping with the way forward for people affected by autism are learning more and more each day.
What is autism spectrum disorder? Well, in parent terms, I think the simplest way for me to conceptualize it is that it's a brain disorder.
So autism spectrum disorder affects a lot of different areas of a child's life. So we think of autism as affecting primarily social interaction. So that's how kids get along with other people.
It affects a child's ability to relate to others and to his or her environment. And that looks very differently among kids with autism and also depending on the age and verbal ability of a child. So what comes naturally to you and to me as far as being able to start a conversation or relate and interact with someone that we're interested in can be very difficult for a child with autism. My daughter, when she was younger, was not interested in friends, her peers, even her siblings. She just was quiet, preferred to be on her own. Some kids with autism want to have friends, but they don't know how to begin to be a friend or to interact with others in order to develop a friendship. And sometimes that has to do with their communication, and sometimes it's their inability to read other people's body language or their cues or to understand the words that they're saying. Some kids are verbal and are able to express themselves with words. Some kids have words, but they don't use them in a very functional way. So they may repeat words, or they may script, they may take lines from movies or television that they use. And sometimes it can be functional, but sometimes they're just repeating. And then there are some kids like my daughter who are completely nonverbal, and she doesn't talk, but she most definitely communicates. She has her own way of letting us know her wants and her needs. It also presents with some unusual behaviors around the areas of restricted interest or repetitive behaviors. And so kids with autism oftentimes get very fixated on a specific thing. So it might be trains for one person. For my daughter, it was a string. She got fixated on strings and kitchen utensils when she was a little girl.
We would also see them sometimes be more restricted in how their schedule is set, how their room is organized. Children with autism often prefer to have things be the same way day in, day out, and can become upset if that routine is disrupted. And then lastly, they might be repetitive in how their body moves. So some children with autism might flap their hands or flick their fingers in front of their eyes repeatedly. So there's different ways that they might show their preference for repetition, either through their body or through their space or through how they play with toys.
What else about autism? Well, there are sensory differences oftentimes with our kids. So the way our kids perceive the world can be very different. So for example, some kids are very particular about their clothing. They may not like the way that a certain fabric feels or the way that tags in shirts or seams on socks feel to them. We may think, well, what's the big deal? But to them, they may experience it as uncomfortable or painful or bothersome. Oftentimes with kids with autism, there's an overload of sensory input. And so they may hear things louder than we hear things. Lights may be brighter. They may be overwhelmed by smells that we don't even notice. And oftentimes it's all of that all at once. And so they aren't able to filter out the extraneous things. And all of that sensory input comes crashing in on them. And it can be very unsettling. And I wish just about every day that I could get in her head and see what she sees and hear what she hears and smell what she smells and taste what she tastes and feel what she feels, because I know it's different than what I do, because her senses are different. And so all of that combined presents very uniquely for every kid on the spectrum.
So with autism, because it's a developmental disorder, we really want to be keeping an eye on what sort of behaviors are concerning. And the reason being is the earlier we can intervene, the earlier we can start changing that trajectory and getting the development kind of back on track, so to speak. But whenever we diagnose autism, we know that we can utilize appropriate interventions that have got empirical support, that are supported by the scientific community. We know that we can use these empirically supported treatments to start making change, no matter what age we make that diagnosis.
People have a way of showing us where they're going to go and what they're going to do that more often than not is breathtakingly outside of our ability to imagine. And so when we're early on faced with the diagnosis, I think that if anybody is going to make predictions, it's going to be that things will be better than they are right now. And how much better and in what form that's going to take is something that the individual is going to demonstrate for us. And what we need to do is make sure that we don't get in the way and that we provide all of the supports we need to ensure that that path is clear going forward.
You know, every child is so wildly different with autism.
Finding out that Angel had autism was hard. It was really hard and overwhelming, and I was in shock.
I would say when I first got the news, my first reaction was, this doctor doesn't know what she's talking about. She's met my son for a half hour, and I've known him 3 years. How can she tell me this is the case when she only looked at him for a half hour and I worked with him for that long? And, it just didn't seem to make sense to me at first.
I could see that she was different. We had like play dates with friends, and she was always more difficult than the other kids. And at that point, I didn't know what was different with her.
I was very hurt that somebody would approach me and suggest that my son had something that I didn't really know anything about, so I was very angry.
Hamza, he had some words until when he is 2 years old. Then the words disappeared after 2 years.
That was the hardest part for Mac's autism. Not the challenging behaviours, not the sleepless nights. It was the loss of his language, and how the sensory side of him just overtook him. And it was really, really difficult, and it's still really difficult.
Even if I didn't want to say it, I knew.
Looking back now, there's a lot of things that I know now that I could have been, oh yeah, he indeed has autism, but I didn't know back then, so I just thought he was quiet because his sister talked for him all the time. He couldn't get a word in edgewise, so I had no clue.
Even though the autism diagnosis is really difficult, it's a bit of a relief for some parents. It was for me, because I spent a year with Mac thinking, what on earth is wrong with you? Like, what is going on?
I had a lot of swing between denial and acceptance. Sometimes I would think, okay, if we hit this head on, he'll be fine in a year from now. Like, he will be cured. He'll be fine. We'll just do this, the therapy course suggested, and he'll be okay. So this is not my reality. And then there were some days where I would just see my son in the corner facing, going up and down as if he was in an elevator, and making beeping noises. And I would think, well, this is my reality, and it's time to, snap out of it and figure out what we can do in order to make this better.
Fairly soon, we started to accept the fact that we just needed to seek out the best help we could, no matter what the degree of how severe his autism was, or how severe it was not. We just needed to start seeking out help and getting help.
Take your time and just give yourself an opportunity to digest what you've just received, the news, and this new reality of what your life's going to be like.
I think what I needed as a mother was moral support from another parent. I needed someone in that parking lot to just say, hey, we did this last year, or we did this 2 years ago. And I know it seems awful now, but it does get better.
Every child's different, and we just have to go along with the ride.